Welcome to the Boardrooms. That's the podcast for CEOs, board directors, investors, leaders, and those who want to rise and serve in the boardrooms of public, private, family-owned, charitable foundations, and exciting high-flying entrepreneurial companies. I'm Nancy May, the CEO of the Board Bench Companies, and I'm your host here today at the Boardrooms Best. And now it's time to charge ahead to lead, challenge, and foster the best in companies worldwide with greater courage, character, confidence, and integrity. Our guest today is Jack Devine, the founding partner and president of the Arkin Group. He is a 32-year veteran of the Central Intelligence Agency, otherwise known as the CIA. He served both as acting director and associate director of the CIA's international operations. In addition, Jack has served as chief of the Latin American division and was principal manager of the CIA's sensitive projects in Latin America. He is a recognized expert in sensitive intelligence matters for the U.S. government and international corporations. During his career at the CIA, he was involved in leading, organizing, planning, and executing countless sensitive matters in virtually all areas of intelligence, including analysis, operations, technology, and management. Earlier in his career with the CIA, he served as head of the Counter-Narcotics Center and also head of the Afghan Task Force, which successfully countered Soviet aggression in the region. Jack is the recipient of the agency's Distinguished Intelligence Medal and several Meritus Awards. He is also known for his op-ed articles in the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, the Financial Times, Foreign Affairs Magazine, the World Policy Journal, Politico, and the Atlantic Monthly. He is a respected guest speaker at the National Press Club and multiple media outlets including CNN, CBS, NBC, MSNBC, Fox News, C-SPAN, Bloomberg News, as well as the History and Discovery channels including PBS, NPR, and ABC Radio. In the private sector, Jack has served on public and private company boards and several government and corporate cybersecurity advisory boards. Jack's book, Good Hunting, An American Spy Master Story, the New York Times bestseller, focuses on his agency career and the role of covert action in the past and the future. It's an honor and pleasure to have my good friend Jack Devine as our guest here today on the Boardroom's Best. He's certainly among the best in the business. Hi, Jack, and welcome to the Boardroom's Best.
Hi, Nancy. It's a pleasure to be here with you.
I always have so much fun talking to you. There's always a new story lurking around the next tree in the next corner when we're getting together. We're here today really sort of talk about what's going on in the boardroom, as we talked earlier. When you look at the corporate boardroom today, many people, from my perspective and talking to them, consider it a part-time job. Yet the role of the board from an investor's perspective is they really don't want to have a director think that this is a part-time job, really, because it's their money that's at stake. And if you're looking from your side of the director's perspective, knowing the CIA background and the investigation work that you do today and the corporate work that you do, what are some of the black holes that directors are missing in the work that they're doing today?
Nancy, I've been out for several years now, and I have my own company, and part of that effort with that company is servicing the needs of boards and companies. And I'm on a couple of boards presently, and I've been on others in the past. And in response to your question, I think the person that thinks he goes to 4 meetings and looks at a stock while he's at the meeting is stepping into very dangerous territory. Pick up any newspaper today, and you can see the boards are faced with lawsuits involving their fiduciary responsibilities, and they're also facing what I would call political or social issues. Misbehavior by CEOs, misbehavior by board members. So while it's only 4 meetings a year on average, they need to be alert for what's going on in the company and certainly what's going on in the business world. And above all, when you're in the realm of acquisition or acquiring new people to lead your company, you need to be steeped in understanding the importance of due diligence, and it shouldn't be just a rote exercise in checking the blocks.
Boy, we're seeing that in Washington today more than ever before, and many people may not consider Washington really sort of a director, but you couldn't really, you really got to look at our elected officials. They have the biggest fiduciary duty of anybody in the world, really, when you think about it, right? So when you think about due diligence, where the heck were they? it's the old adage, where were the directors? So you've got some pretty interesting stories on due diligence as it relates to both foreign and domestic companies. Why don't we talk a little bit about, since the Russians are front and center today, some of the work that goes on from a due diligence perspective that you've seen that corporate directors and boards have really missed even on that front.
I'd be glad to. I would only add...
If you can, that is, obviously.
I can talk about it, but
right.
we're going to have to change some of the names.
To protect the innocent.
The one thing I would point out, going back to the board just a second, only
Sure.
to comment that if you're on the audit committee or compensation committee, you are especially vulnerable and accountable for decisions made that relate to the corporate well-being. So coming back to one of the areas that I'm fascinated by, I've dealt with some corporations, hedge funds, ranging from mid-cap to large-cap. And what is interesting is each of them approaches due diligence differently. Many are steeped in it. I mean, they really have a rigorous compliance due diligence process. Okay. It starts with their own internal processes and requirements on what must be done, what checks have to take place, and then you step out into the outside world to get support because there's only so much that your internal mechanism can do for you. I would note that there's a very large number of companies. It's almost like the issue of security and cybersecurity is this is a cost, and they're reluctant to pay the cost, and they'd rather take the risk. Now, the news is replete with what happens. I mean, certainly in the cyber area recently, but over and over again I confront problems where boards have not done the due diligence, and we have to undertake an investigation that could have been avoided if they had done it before the investment is made. The problem is the post-investigation is much more complex and requires, I'm just going to arbitrarily say, 2 to 3 times much money, if not more, to answer questions that could have been easily answered before they got involved with it.
Right, and it doesn't just impact the company itself necessarily or the director's liability, but it actually impacts all the customers as well that might get caught up in this. True?
Absolutely. One of the things that I would state for board members as they go through this process is, you don't want to deal with yellow and pink flags. I mean, if you say, look, I only want to deal with a red flag. If you tell me there's a red flag, the guy's been arrested 5 times, we won't make the deal. And the problem is, a lot of companies have gone down the path of all the negotiations and have the deal ready, and then they start the due diligence late in the process, and they're very reluctant to walk away. My best clients do it at the beginning, very early. If they see a red flag, they move on. And certainly if they even see a yellow flag, they really want to dig down to make sure they know that that yellow flag is really minimalist threat. But I've dealt with others, and they've paid the price further down the road, and that is, look, so he's done a few of these things. Now, it doesn't mean he's going to do it again. And they talk themselves into looking past the due diligence and going forward anyway and taking a risk. Sometimes they get lucky and it works out and they sell it before, the chickens come home to roost. But I would encourage boards to get your due diligence process started early and don't live with markers that distinguish this company from a solid and good company that, you would like to see your family invested in.
Right, it's the old trust but verify, and to put it a little softly, once a stinker, always a stinker kind of scenario.
Well, I've encountered that where we actually had a fellow come to us and he wanted us to do a self-due diligence
yeah,
corporation because he had been in prison for some wheeling and dealing in the stock market, and he was, born again and now has understood the shortcomings in that, and he wanted me to certify with a costly due diligence that he was a man of a reformed and upstanding citizen. Right. We took a pass because it just didn't feel to us that all the spots on the leopard had disappeared, so we didn't even bother pursuing this. And lo and behold, our judgment turned to be wise because he did go forward, found somebody to certify it, did an IPO, and about a year and a half later was arrested again for stock manipulation. So don't talk yourself into things. Now, we didn't sidetracked myself there, but
sure.
You did ask about some of the things that you can encounter in the foreign arena. And on the question of Russia, we could address China if we like. Mm-hmm. First, let me say the positive in the United States, why you can be snookered and have a bad deal. There was an awful lot of regulatory oversight that chances are less high that you're going to have a disaster on your hands. A bad investment is a bad investment anywhere in the world, but in terms of having trouble finding the data to make the decision, the United States is a relatively positive environment for trying to get a handle on a company.
Right.
But when you go abroad, the databases, the records process is more obscure, and I'm being kind about obscure. And corruption creeps into many parts of the world, and bribery is not uncommon. And that causes problems for U.S. firms because of our own laws, that our Foreign Corrupt Practices Act.
Right.
You can't engage in these activities. So if you aren't aware of that and think that there's a way to bypass it, you're stepping on treacherous territory.
And the temptation is high for the executives. Not too long ago, there was a president over at Walmart that down in Mexico that got caught for this. And I remember meeting with a director that knew this fellow and was interested in bringing him onto his board, and they were just waiting to see if, in fact, this was going to be an issue. And I heard the news that the fellow had been we'll call it taken out, basically resigned from the company as a result. As on the radio, as I was going to meet this fellow, and then the conversation came up over a glass of wine at the end of the day, and I said, your decision has been made for you. And he said, what do you mean? I said, well, it's just public news. I heard it even before I got here. So I announced to him that his best candidate was no longer his best candidate, and his jaw just dropped.
Well,
I had no idea that this would make it to the news.
One of the most dangerous things is when the CEOs and people on the board are bringing longtime friends.
Yes.
They want to bring them and introduce them into the equation. They've never done a due diligence on their friends, and there are secrets that everybody has, and
Correct.
Maybe he's a great partner at the golf club, and looks like he ostensibly has a large amount of money. There was a famous case down in Florida. This is going back 10 years. It was Vanity Fair and a few other places covered it. But everybody at the country club this was in the Bernie Madoff phase, which was another example of it. And he was a mini Madoff, but he was donated money to the community and to the golf club, but it was all a Potonkin village. It was a facade. But let me go to your question about a couple of countries and
Sure.
the types of things that you encounter. A major bank was buying an acquisition of another bank. And what I was impressed with, they wanted us to look at every member on the board in about 10 countries. I mean, this is a massive investigative effort.
This is after they were on the board?
Pardon?
This is after they were on the board, correct? Not before.
No, they were about to acquire a company that had branch offices being large banks in other countries, right? So it's not their branch office like New York.
So it's an acquisition due diligence.
Due diligence, right? So here you multiply it, maybe you had 50 people. I think it actually was close to 60 as I think about it. Now, we were not going to do the 360, but we were going to take a look. They made an investment. This is out-of-pocket money to take a look at each of the board directors. And lo and behold, of the 60, and again, I'm ballparking the numbers because several years ago, 59 of them look very positive at the first blush, right? So it would be just cost prohibitive to go much deeper. But the 59th one, if you will, it showed that person had ties into Colombia and to drug trafficking, and particularly in the money laundering, right? So the company stopped right there and said, look, we're going to do an acquisition. You're going to have to take that guy out of your board. And if not, we're not going anywhere. So I would say, 1 out of 50 companies would have done the due diligence on all the board members at the what I would call tier 1 level. It would have been a disaster if you think about you acquire this bank and you have a money launderer in your board network.
That's so good.
The second thing, when I look at Russia, I was impressed by one of our clients when I first started into the business, and that they had done all the books. And for many companies, it's looking at the financials or the due diligences, and you say, well, look, the numbers all add up. It looks good. But this particular company was in heavy industry, and it needed the port facilities in Russia. In other words, if the ports weren't operating, then no matter what the book said, it would be a losing proposition. So they asked us, this wasn't me coming up with a bright idea. Mm-hmm. They said, look, we want to be sure those ports, so we want to know what are the labor unions like at that port facility? Will we have to pay bribes? Are they uncontrollable? What does the company have ties into the Kremlin so that if there's a problem in this place, will the government be supportive, or would they be part of the problem? A very interesting, complicated question, but it's the lifeline. So if you're sitting on the board and someone comes in and briefs a wonderful company making all this money, and then you realize, but there's some vulnerabilities here. And unless that's presented to you, you might bypass it. Turns out, fortunately for the company, that we were able to establish that they could work with the unions, and that there had been cooperation from the company, and that the government was in sync. So they went forward. It's been a profitable business since. But if they had gotten that wrong, they would have lost a lot of money.
Right, and this is not just only exclusive to corporations who are physically located around the world, but also domestic companies that might be working with a vendor, correct?
Well, you have a whole set of problems in that regard. All companies now rely on vendors. One of the things, I'm on the board of a major company. I'm on their cybersecurity advisory board, mm-hmm. and the issue that comes up there is part of your IT is outsourced to vendors. So are the vendors who they say they are? Can they provide the support that's needed? What's their reputation? So, again, these are all costs that go out the door for the company. It eats into the profits, but I find that the more prudent, successful, long-running companies make that investment. So in the United States, knowing the vendors, knowing their record, reliability, their security practices. I mean, not to get into the national security arena, but NSA has been hammered. The National Security Agency, the Intercept Intelligence Agency, has been hammered really hard by the likes of Snowden, right. And more recently, and the name escapes me, but a fellow who also had taken classified material out of the system, and they were contractors.
Yeah. So it's a lot.
You need to know your vendors, and you need to know the contractors involved in it.
So is it more easy to have control, and I'll use the word control loosely, of physical, tangible assets than it is your intellectual property, which could sort of slip out the door a lot faster? And if so, or if it's not more easily to control, how do you know who to trust beyond doing due diligence? Are there other ways to sort of dive in?
There's an expression in the intelligence world, shared among all services, friend and foe alike.
Yeah.
There are no friends in the intelligence business, okay? So it's a bit harsh. There are friends for sure. But what it says is be alert. Even when you think you're on the most friendly territory, bad things can happen. So intellectual property, I think, certainly in the United States, certainly in the EU, I mean, there are rules, laws, there's regulatory aspects to it. And I don't want to pick on the Chinese today, but they are well known for loose policies for intellectual property. So if a company is going to put their facility in China and it has unique intellectual property, they need to factor into the equation that intellectual property will be bled off of the company, and it will be appearing in in Chinese outlets, and there will be no compensation for it. And you can go into the Chinese judicial system, but remember, I mean, it's still a communist state. People don't like to think about it, but it is not. It's not the rule of law. It's not the judicial process that we have grown up with in the United States. So beware, buyer beware. In this part, I would say seller beware of your intellectual property. If you're not prepared to lose it. If it's the lifeblood of your company, this unique product, then you better do due diligence into the environment, whatever country you choose to go to. It's not, you might find a place that's inexpensive labor, but if you're going to lose it all, then that is not a cost-effective way of doing business.
Right. There's a public story that's been on the news in years past about a manufacturer of the big wind turbine, engines, and they were a U.S. company that was having a lot of their parts manufactured overseas. Again, not to pick on China, but it was being done in a low-cost environment, and then that their equipment is being sold back to a U.S. creator, shall we say, a manufacturer of the bigger systems. And what had happened is the Chinese vendor, had basically stolen the intellectual capital of this company for years, and they didn't know about it. All of a sudden, that vendor becomes their biggest competition, selling the equipment back to the customer's main customer, and basically wiped them out in less than a year, once they actually got their hooks into the customer, the bigger customer, the global customer. And this guy had nothing he could do. There was absolutely no recourse to get his IP back. It was gone. And frightening to see how an entrepreneur who had built a multi-million, billion-dollar company just wiped out in a matter of months.
Well, I would like to say this is a unique experience, but unfortunately, business history, modern times, demonstrates that this is a recurring problem. I had run in the power industry, this again going back a few years,
right.
But they did their due diligence. The company was very productive, run very efficiently, and they made the acquisition.
Mm-hmm.
After the company was up and running a year, they realized that 30% of the power was being spun off and into another factory in the vicinity, and it turned out that their CEO, it was his cousin in the other factory. They were both party members, and they were tied into the local political structure in this. It wasn't in Beijing, it was in the hinterland, but because of the power aspect of it. And you'd say, okay, let's go to court. Well, you're going to a system that is, rigged against you. So, this goes back to my story about the labor unions and the unions and the port facilities. And that is, when you're sitting on a board seat and you're looking at building a power plant and so on, you have to lean back in your chair or get help in leaning back in your chair and say, what are all the other ramifications? Where can we be bit on this thing? You kick it around. You kick around with people like ours that, spend their careers looking around the world and knowing the culture and having assets and capabilities around the world that enable you to answer the question, well, we're going to buy this company. What are its political ties?
Right.
What are the risks? And the cost is truly, by board standards, the due diligence, this type of due diligence, far less expensive than the looking at the books and all, which is mandatory and necessary. But this is a small cost, and I guarantee you, if you don't pay it up front, you pay it on the back end. Back end is painful, usually considerably more costly. So a board that go to a meeting 4 times a month, you better...
Or 4 times a year.
4 times a year.
They don't want to do it 4 times a month.
I have one where you have a call once a week, which is kind of interesting.
Yeah.
So that they want you to be plugged into it. It is time-consuming, and they need to compensate accordingly. But the 4 times a year, those meetings have to be well-driven. By that I mean it has to be an agenda.
Right.
You're going to have dinner, you're going to have briefings. But when you get into the acquisition, investments abroad particularly, you really need to stop, look, and listen, and you need to invest in collecting more information about the deal than you would normally do in the U.S. I would point out one more time that the way companies get in trouble, they really think they know the people and company because they've dealt with them before. They know the Minister of Transportation,
right.
And they get lulled into this
comfort,
into this frame of mind that makes them make what I would call a bad business decision.
Right.
Just one last note. I notice that people are getting really smart, particularly in the retail industry, in the cyberspace. In other words, they're now paying for the capabilities and resources, and they're bringing so much compliance into the system. And I think they're developing it's an antibiotic, if you will,
ahead of the curve. So they're being defensive versus offensive.
I like doctors that practice preventive medicine.
Correct. All right, that's probably a better term that people understand.
And I think that's what we're part of that triage team, if you will, as you are.
Right.
And helping boards make wise decisions that protect them from fiduciary lawsuits.
Well, and ask the uncomfortable questions, because it's not something they're used to doing. As much as directors say they are, it's doing the dive underneath the covers, so to speak, that is not particularly comfortable for them, or being able to put together questions in a way so that the people that you're interviewing, because this is what we do, sort of open up to you and start to feel comfortable, and will tell you things that you wouldn't be able to find in the past. I mean, we found some amazing things about potential directors that nobody is going to believe that we were able to get. And it's just by building a relationship of trust with the people that you're interviewing with. And I've never even met in some cases. It just comes out on the phone. It's fascinating to me.
And not all investigative firms, not all research firms, not all headhunters are the same in how they approach these, and do have to do the interviewing. And it's not just the references. You have to find the people that are not put on the list, because they're more likely to tell you of aberrant behavior. The only thing on the board that I would underline is when you start this process of the inquisitive, looking for the danger spots, it may be hard work at the beginning, but once a board starts to develop the process and it becomes part of their culture, it becomes easier and more robust just by the nature that people are used to asking tough questions, because they have the experience of seeing what you find, what goes wrong. But it takes some time, and I would urge boards to do this like they were getting ready for any sort of sports activity, training, getting in condition, and changing the culture. If it is one of 4 meetings a year, then change the culture of making those 4 meetings be dig-down meetings, not listening and just signing and raising your hand to support whatever the decision is.
Yeah, and in the process of due diligence, when you're asking questions, and in this particular case we're talking about directors, prospective directors, or maybe even a prospective C-suite person, what I found is that a difficult question does not have to be one that is contentious or threatening. And it's how you craft the dialogue, really, to get at the underlying information in a way. You find the same thing?
Well, you took the words out of my mouth, which is, tough questions have to be asked. There's a style, and I think there's a style of doing it in a way that not everybody, if it's accusatory or it's negative-based. It's really an information-based question. Have we looked at this? And if not, why not? And why don't we think about, there's a way of doing this. Most of the boards I've been on do tend to avoid conflict. So it isn't really, you don't necessarily have to go to the State Department Foreign Policy course to understand the diplomacy of the boardroom. But the questions have to be asked. And sometimes, frankly, you have to take a stand.
Yes.
And you have to say, look, we're going to get crosswise the SEC. This is going to be an investment that's going to tank. The stockholders are going to want an explanation for this. The media, I mean, there are lots of issues, and sometimes they do come up, but you save your fire for the tough ones. But the whole process should be more inquisitive, seeking more information.
Yeah, I have another question for you, which may or may not necessarily be directly related, but all boards still need to do their due diligence on CEOs, even if they're sitting in sort of their seats. If there's any question of, I don't want to quite use the term corruption, or any question of lack of ethics, shall we say, in that C-suite, how do you see boards really diving in and doing their due diligence without creating sort of a negative ripple effect, because obviously you want to cut out the situation if there is a problem immediately. But in the meantime, that's a hard job for a board to do when there's any suspicion of corruption or abuse in a C-suite. There's a certain level of trust that's there to begin with. How do you help a board really go through that process without making it contentious to start with?
I'm really disappointed because I thought you were going to answer that question for me. It's one of the hardest questions.
Yeah, it's hard. I mean, there are ways to do it, but you're the CIA guy.
So if you have a sitting CEO, I think it would be extraordinarily brave.
Yes.
For one of the board members to raise his hand and say, look, I think we ought to do a due diligence on you now. So I think I'm not a master of this, but I mean, there may come a time where the board says, look, we should do a due diligence on all of us so that we can go before. In other words, you don't single out the CEO or the chairman of the board, right?
Right.
Now, if the CEO is on the board, it's a very, very tricky problem. If it's a chairman and the CEO is not on the board.
Right.
Then I think it's an easier way to raise it and more frankly. Now, every board member should have an alliance with the general counsel.
Correct.
Now, the general counsel wants to protect the company, wants to protect the CEO, but they also want to protect themselves and they know the law.
Self-preservation.
There's a way of, depends on the certain positioning, the legal counsel saying, look, we ought to have an opinion and we ought to look at A, B, C.
Right.
Once you see a yellow light come up on the CEO, then it can be addressed fairly frankly but diplomatically that, look, because there is this yellow flag, it's for the good of the company, Jim or Joe, whatever his name is. You understand this has to be done, and I think you have to do it. But if you're doing it preventively and there's no red flag, no yellow flag, not even a whiff, someone has to do a finesse and say, look, for the shareholders or whatever, we need to do a background on everybody. And I think you need to stay, I talked about compliance, I talked about fiduciary and political sensitivities on the board, but certainly legal and having a good understanding, being briefed, making the general counsel be part of the board discussions. Are there any legal issues, any things we need to be concerned about? We've got everything covered. In other words, you put that person on the spot to answer the tough questions rather than necessarily confronting the CEO. But each case is difficult. If a board member finds themselves in an area of possible conflict, possible jeopardy legally, the smart ones, most board members have legal counsel that they can touch.
Correct.
That would be my first stop is, what do you think? Am I reading too much into it? How do we best strategize this thing? I wouldn't carry the water by myself.
Yeah. So one sort of last question before we wrap this up is, the frontline headline news has been in the last couple of weeks about a credit monitoring agency. And a hack that happened and what goes on. So now, where do you see some of this happening? And not to overlook, go too far on the cyber area, because that's certainly a frightening area for everybody, every consumer, every director, every CEO, what it might do. But where do you see some of the big challenges going forward, or ways that directors are starting to think differently? I'm seeing some, but I'm not seeing real aggressive movement in the space of how do we really dig in to do the work at a better level. And I think part of it, quite frankly, is fear of time. And, the term fear in the boardroom is not quite often used enough. Not from a fear of loss of the company, but, from fear of what they should be doing and how much time is it taking. I mean, I've even heard one chairman of a board in a number of years past said, when they did get into trouble, I don't get paid enough for this.
Yeah,
I mean, when you hear that, to me, every other director in the boardroom should be scared out of their cotton-picking wits.
Well, it's true of every board member. It doesn't matter until you're facing a major lawsuit, right?
Right,
So,
you're up against the wall.
But one of the things, let's focus on the cyber part of this. What I've found in the last couple of years, particularly, a board getting more savvy on the cyber threat. I'm afraid to say that the vast majority of boards the IT thing is too technical, too far. That we got the IT. They're doing whatever they're doing.
Trust him.
And the boards are not involved. They're not briefed on it. They don't know the cyber people. They don't know what they're doing. They don't. So the better ones actually have the IT. Whether it's annually or semi-annually, they get a briefing
Reporting in.
This is what we're doing in the compliance IT area. These are the threats. These are the attacks we've had. This is the way we're dealing with it. Boards, my closing admonition to the board, beyond the due diligence process, which is the cornerstone,
right,
is you need to get to know your IT cyber team. You don't have to be a whiz like your grandkids or your children, but you're a smart business person. You'll listen to and you make sure you get someone who speaks in English and not cyber talk. But there is a way to make a sound decision on are you getting the bang for the buck. And you can get equipment, and the equipment is not necessarily the answer. So
right.
The more you get briefings, the more you understand it. And what I provide is a service, and I'm not touting this, but, we provide a consulting service where a fellow that has deep, rich experience from the government, frankly, my old outfit, comes in and talks to the boards about the cyber threat.
Great.
And he does it as a layman, and the cyber team. And we guarantee the board is we're selling no equipment, no program. In other words, you just get the consulting, because otherwise if someone comes in, they're going to tell you your machine's wrong, you need another machine, you need to do this or that.
They're selling you something versus educating. Yeah.
Boards should get educated more about the cyber arena as it relates to their company. And I know people don't want to over-invest in time, but to me, this can be done relatively easy. They don't need to know the algorithms that drive all of their systems, but they need to know what steps are we taking? How are we vetting our vendors? In the cyber world, how are we vetting, the employees? What systems do we have? What checks and balances? Insider threat? All these issues are now being kicked around in subcommittees. In other words, I'm on an advisory board to the board.
Right.
But that advisory board meets and is going over nothing but cyber, and then the general counsel is on that board with us, and he briefs the board on a regular basis on what's being done. That's a great marriage, and I would recommend all boards that have a cyber profile need to do something similar.
Yeah, we worked with a very large global financial institution in the past, and I remember having a conversation with the GC who said, in response to a question which I offered, is, how important is technology to you? And any company, I don't care who you are and what you do, technology, whether it be cyber or technology is related to hard goods and your IP in some way, shape, or form, is a technology company. And the response to my question was, well, we're kind of a back-of-the-envelope institution, in which case my eyes nearly popped out and fell on the floor. So you can imagine what happened thereafter.
I'm not an investment firm, but I short that company.
Yes, exactly.
Nancy,
it's been a pleasure, Jack.
Yeah,
and we can continue on.
It's a pleasure talking to you as always, and have a great day. And
thank you very much.
And good hunting, as we say.
Yes, absolutely. You too. And thank you, Jack. We'll continue on in another call. Take care. Have a great day.